afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. As we come to the end of this case, as you prepare to deliberate and give a decision, I want to point something out. Something that we've listened to at this trial together. We've listened to a lot. Whether it was testimony from the parties themselves or testimonies from the experts we've called to come in and help you guys make a good decision here. I think we've noticed two things. There's been a difference of fact and opinion in parts of this case, of what actually happened and what that means, or how we can interpret that. But there's one thing that we don't disagree about here. Not my client and not the defendant. We agree that Robert was shot in his back. He was shot in his back as he got up off the ground. Leading up to that, he got out of his car in what was a road incident disagreement. He was punched in the face by Morris Levy, dragged to the back of the patrol car, thrown on the ground where he hit his head on the bumper. And when Morris Levy got on top of him, for the first time, identifying to Robert that he was a police officer. Just moments after doing so, the defendant, Edward Waldman, came around the back of the patrol car and shot my client in his back as he was trying to get up off of the ground. He shot him at point-blank range. Close enough to grab him. That makes Robert an innocent victim. An innocent victim of police brutality. The only way that's not true is if Edward Waldman had some sort of justification for his actions. He needs a reason, a legal excuse for that behavior. Now, you've listened to what their excuse is. It's just one excuse. It's that my client had this knife. And that he was in the process of using this knife to stab Morris Levy. And that's why Edward Waldman got to shoot him in the back. As he was getting off the ground, a defenseless position. Without that excuse, Robert's a victim, and you cannot find for the defendants. So what do we know about this knife anyway? Well, we know a couple things. You heard it through the testimony. We know that Robert doesn't own this type of knife. This is a pocket knife or a jackknife. Do we have an evidence? It has a locking blade. Robert owns a utility knife for work. And he owns a fishing knife for his pastime, for his hobby. But he doesn't own this knife, and he especially doesn't own this type of knife. Now, what else do we know about it? Well, we know that the defendants allege my client got out of his vehicle, and with the knife in his right hand, he ran toward Morris Levy. And when he got to Morris Levy, he raised the knife and stabbed him, and was actually about to stab him again when he was shot. And that's why the defendant had to shoot him, because he was about to stab his partner again. Both Morris Levy and Officer Waldman say that it was in his right hand. But you heard testimony that Robert's not right-handed. Robert does his work with his left hand. He eats with his left hand. His own wife testified that she bought a baseball glove. Left-handed for Robert. He does everything with this hand, not with this hand, as the defendants have tried to claim. Now, what else do we know about the knife? Well, we know that if Robert had stabbed somebody with this knife, say Morris Levy in his shoulder, there would be a lot of things about this knife that could tell us that happened. From the forensics lab, additional evidence that could have been brought in to prove that Robert used this knife. But instead, you've heard testimony. There was no fingerprints on this knife. Forensic lab didn't find any. And there was no blood on this blade. In short, there was no DNA on this knife that matches my client. My client never touched this knife. Now, the defendants did not submit into evidence Morris Levy's clothes that he had that night, right? Because if Robert had stabbed Morris Levy with a knife, he would have torn his jacket and torn his shirt up. And they could have just as easily brought that evidence into this courtroom today to prove to you the existence of this knife in Robert's hands. But they didn't do that. They haven't proven that to you because they can't prove that to you. They don't have the shirt and the jacket with the tear in it. What are we to believe about that? That it was lost? Or maybe that it was like this knife itself? That they tampered with evidence? They mishandled evidence relevant to this case? You know, one of the last things as this scenario wound up was that Edward Waldman called for medical help. He had a man, my client Robert, who he had just shot, bleeding out on the ground profusely. I mean, you've heard the testimony. How he was shot in his back, and it went through his entire body, ricocheted off his scapula, lodged near his heart. It almost killed him. That's who's on the ground. That's Robert, somebody that's almost died, that's in pain, that's going to go on to become unconscious, to go to the hospital, to have medical bills, miss work. Once he gets back to work, he's not going to be able to do the overhead lifting he was able to. He's not going to be able to do a lot of things he was able to. He's not going to be able to play basketball the same way with his son or play on the softball league with his friends. That's who's on the ground. That's who's been shot in the back. The defendant calls for medical help and gives the wrong address, costing Robert 10 minutes of danger to his life. Now, that was a mistake. Giving the wrong address could have been a mistake. But it was no mistake that it gave Edward Waldman complete access to this crime scene with no other witnesses to change anything about it he wanted. He made another mistake. Because you see, the last thing we know about this knife is that it was found at the scene closed. How to explain that? A locking blade knife in the hand of someone who's just been shot? Depressed the lever, closed it, and set it down? This knife doesn't make any sense. The defense haven't offered any logical explanation how this fits into our case today. That's because Robert didn't use this knife. He didn't have a knife that night. He was an unarmed, innocent victim. And the defendant nearly killed him and cost him something that none of us want to go through. Excruciating pain, medical bills, and a loss of enjoyment of life. Robert's life was turned upside down from this. I'm asking you guys, I'm asking you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to help correct this scenario for Robert's sake. Please find for my client, because without the knife, there's no case here. No knife, no case. You can't find for the defendants. Thank you for your time.